On June 10, 1991, an 11-year-old girl wearing her favorite pink outfit walked toward her school bus stop in a quiet California mountain community. And in broad daylight, with her stepfather watching helplessly from just yards away, she was snatched off the street by a convicted rapist who should have been in prison, beginning 18 years of captivity in a hidden backyard compound where she would be raped, impregnated twice, and forced to raise two daughters before a chance encounter at a university campus would finally bring her nightmare to an end and expose one of the most catastrophic failures of the parole system in American history. Before we dive in, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we uncover another case that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Jaycee Lee Dugard came into this world on May 3, 1980, in the resort town of South Lake Tahoe, California, a place known for its stunning natural beauty, its crystal-clear alpine lake straddling the California-Nevada border, and its reputation as a safe, family-friendly community nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Lake Tahoe itself is one of the most beautiful bodies of water in North America. A massive alpine lake so clear you can see to depths of 70 feet, surrounded by mountains that turn white with snow in winter and green with pine forests in summer. It was the kind of place where parents felt comfortable letting their children walk to school, where neighbors knew each other by name, where the worst crimes anyone worried about were the occasional car break-in or petty theft from tourists visiting the casinos on the Nevada side of the lake. The community surrounding Lake Tahoe had developed a reputation as a sanctuary from the dangers of urban California. Families from Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sacramento would move to the area specifically because they believed it would be safer for their children. The crime rates were lower, the schools were smaller and more personal. The pace of life was slower. Children could ride their bikes through the streets, could play in their front yards, could walk to the school bus stop without their parents worrying that something terrible might happen. It was, in many ways, the American dream of small-town safety transplanted to the mountains. Jaycee's mother, Terry Dugard, had met Jaycee's biological father, Ken Slayton, while both were on camping vacations in Arizona. Theirs was a brief relationship, a summer romance that ended almost as soon as it began. Slayton returned to his life, unaware that he had fathered a child. Terry, discovering she was pregnant, chose to raise the baby on her own. Jaycee grew up never knowing her biological father, never having a relationship with him, never even knowing his name until much later. Slayton, for his part, didn't know he had a daughter until investigators contacted him after Jaycee's kidnapping, a fact that would quickly clear him of any suspicion in her disappearance. You can't kidnap a child you don't know exists. Jaycee grew up knowing only her mother and, later, her stepfather. Terry worked hard to provide for her daughter, building a life as a single mother in an era when that was more difficult than it is today. She was determined to give Jaycee a good childhood, to provide her with stability and love, to be both mother and father to the little girl who had become the center of her world. When Jaycee was 7 years old, her mother married a carpet contractor named Carl Probin. Carl became the father figure in Jaycee's life, though by her own later accounts, they were never particularly close. Still, Carl was there, part of the fabric of her daily existence, a presence she took for granted the way children take for granted the adults who care for them. In 1990, when Jaycee was 10, Terry gave birth to Jaycee's half-sister Shayna, adding another member to their small family unit. That same year, in September 1990, the family made a decision that would haunt them forever. They moved from Arcadia, in Los Angeles County, to the small community of Myers, just south of South Lake Tahoe. The reason for the move was simple and achingly ironic. They believed Myers would be a safer place to raise their children. Away from the sprawl and crime of greater Los Angeles, surrounded by mountains and forests and clean mountain air, they thought they were giving Jaycee and baby Shayna the gift of a childhood free from the dangers of urban life. Myers was exactly what they hoped for. A quiet, rural community, where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where children rode their bikes through the streets without fear, where the biggest excitement was the changing of the seasons, and the occasional visit from wildlife wandering down from the surrounding wilderness. Jaycee enrolled in school and quickly made friends. She was, by all accounts, a normal, happy 11-year-old girl, curious about the world, excited about life, looking forward to an upcoming school field trip that she had been talking about for weeks. On the morning of June 10, 1991, everything about the day seemed ordinary. Terry Probyn, who worked as a typesetter at a print house, left for work early, as she did most mornings. Carl was at home, in the garage, going about his morning routine. Jaycee woke up, got dressed in her favorite outfit, an all-pink ensemble that made her feel pretty and grown up, and prepared to walk to the school bus stop, just a short distance up the hill from their house on Washone Boulevard. The walk to the bus stop was one Jaycee had made countless times before. It was maybe a few hundred yards, close enough that her stepfather could watch her from the garage if he chose to look up. The route took her up a gentle hill against traffic toward the corner where the school bus would pick her up and take her to school. It was the kind of walk that millions of children across America made every day, the kind of routine activity that parents never thought twice about. At approximately 8:10 in the morning, as Jaycee walked up the hill toward the bus stop, a gray car, later identified as possibly a Ford Monarch or Granada, approached from behind her. Jaycee, like most 11-year-olds, probably didn't pay much attention to it at first. Cars passed by all the time. Maybe she thought the driver was going to ask for directions, or maybe she didn't think about it at all. What happened next took only seconds, but would define the next 18 years of Jaycee's life. The car pulled up alongside her. The driver's door flew open. A man stepped out, a man with a stun gun in his hand. Before Jaycee could scream, before she could run, before she could do anything to protect herself, he pressed the weapon against her small body and sent thousands of volts of electricity coursing through her, causing her muscles to seize, her body to collapse. Carl Probyn, in the garage of the family home, heard something, a sound, a movement that made him look up. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. His stepdaughter being grabbed by strangers and pulled into a car. He heard Jaycee scream, that distinctive, terrified scream of a child in mortal danger, and then the car was moving, speeding away up the hill. Carl didn't hesitate. He grabbed his mountain bike and took off in pursuit, pedaling as hard as he could up the hill, trying desperately to catch the car, to get a license plate number, to do something, anything, to save the little girl who had just been stolen from in front of his eyes. But a man on a bicycle, no matter how determined, cannot catch a car. The gray sedan disappeared over the crest of the hill and was gone, taking Jaycee with it. Carl, exhausted and frantic, turned around and raced back home, screaming at neighbors to call 911. He had witnessed the unthinkable, a child abducted in broad daylight in a community that was supposed to be safe, from right in front of her own home, and he had been powerless to stop it. Jaycee's classmates, some of whom were already at the bus stop, had also witnessed parts of the abduction. Multiple people had seen the car, had seen the man, had seen the woman in the passenger seat who had helped pull Jaycee into the vehicle. There were witnesses. There was a description of the car. There was even a rough description of the suspects. This should have been a case that could be solved quickly. Within minutes, the search for Jaycee Dugard began. The California Highway Patrol set up roadblocks at exits from the Lake Tahoe Basin, questioning drivers as they left the area. Local law enforcement began canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing witnesses, gathering every scrap of information they could find. Search teams with dogs were deployed. Aircraft scanned the surrounding wilderness. The FBI was called in to assist. On June 11th, just one day after the abduction, Terry Probyn held a press conference, her face drawn with anguish, pleading with whoever had taken her daughter to return her safely. Rewards were quickly established. $5,000 from El Dorado County secret witness, another $5,000 from the family, for any information leading to Jaycee's return. The community rallied around the Probyns, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, doing everything they could think of to help find the missing girl. On June 14, 1991, just 4 days after the kidnapping, Jaycee's case was featured on the Fox television show America's Most Wanted. The program broadcast a composite drawing of the suspect seen in the car, hoping that someone, somewhere, would recognize the face and call in a tip. The case attracted nationwide attention, with media outlets from across the country covering the story of the little girl snatched from a quiet mountain community. But despite all this attention, despite the witnesses, despite the descriptions, despite the massive search effort, no reliable leads were generated. The gray car seemed to have vanished into thin air. The man and woman who had taken Jaycee were ghosts, leaving no trace that investigators could follow. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there was no sign of Jaycee Dugard. The investigation, as is standard in child abduction cases, initially focused on those closest to the victim. Carl Probyn, despite having witnessed the kidnapping and desperately tried to stop it, became a suspect. He was interrogated multiple times by the FBI, subjected to polygraph after polygraph. Ken Slayton, Jaycee's biological father, was also investigated, though he was quickly cleared. He hadn't even known he had a daughter until investigators contacted him. Carl Probyn passed every polygraph test he was given. The investigators, to their credit, were thorough. They needed to rule out the possibility of family involvement before they could focus their resources elsewhere. But for Carl, the experience was devastating. Not only had he been unable to save his stepdaughter, but now he was being treated as a potential perpetrator, forced to prove his innocence while the real kidnappers remained free. I knew the FBI was going to put me through the ringer, and that was okay, Carl would say years later. But the strain of being a suspect, combined with the trauma of having witnessed the abduction and the crushing guilt of not being able to prevent it, took its toll on the family. Within a few years, Terry and Carl Probyn would separate. Carl has said that one of the reasons for their divorce was that Terry could never forgive him for not being able to save Jaycee, a burden of guilt that Carl himself has carried ever since. The years that followed Jaycee's disappearance were a nightmare for Terry Probyn. She has described spending the first decade after the kidnapping taking a week off work every Christmas, and on the anniversary of the abduction, just to stay home and cry. She founded a group called Jaycee's Hope, which directed volunteer and fundraising efforts to keep the search alive. T-shirts, sweatshirts, buttons, and cassette tapes of a song called Jaycee Lee were sold to raise money for poster materials, postage, and printing. Child Quest International and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were involved in the effort. Every year, on the anniversary of Jaycee's kidnapping, there were candlelight vigils, prayer services, marches. The community refused to forget. Terry Probyn refused to give up hope. But as years passed with no leads, no sightings, no evidence that Jaycee was still alive, even hope became hard to maintain. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that while they searched and prayed and hoped, Jaycee was alive. She was less than 200 miles away, in a suburban backyard, living a nightmare beyond comprehension. And the people who had taken her were not strangers to the criminal justice system. In fact, the man who had snatched Jaycee off the street should have been in prison at the time of her kidnapping. His name was Philip Craig Garrido. To understand how Philip Garrido came to be free on June 10, 1991, and how he was able to keep Jaycee Dugard captive for 18 years, while supposedly under the watchful eye of the parole system, we need to go back to the beginning of his criminal history, a history that should have kept him behind bars for decades, a pattern of escalating violence that the system repeatedly failed to address. Philip Craig Garrido was born on April 5, 1951, in Pittsburgh, California, an industrial city in the East Bay region of the San Francisco Bay Area. Pittsburgh was a working-class town, dominated by steel mills and manufacturing plants that lined the Suisun Bay waterfront. It was the kind of place where kids grew up fast, where opportunities were limited, where some young men fell into trouble simply because there wasn't much else to do. By all accounts, Garrido's childhood was troubled, though the specifics of what he experienced have never been fully documented. What is clear is that by the time he graduated from high school in 1969, he was already showing signs of the darkness that would define his adult life. That same year, barely out of his teens, he was arrested for drug possession, the beginning of a pattern of criminal behavior that would escalate over the following years and decades. But drug possession was just the surface. Garrido had developed other interests, other appetites that would prove far more dangerous. He had begun using LSD heavily, a habit that would later become part of his defense when he was eventually caught for more serious crimes. He would claim that 7 years of LSD use had damaged his mind, had warped his thinking, had contributed to his criminal behavior. Whether this was true or simply a convenient excuse is impossible to know. In 1972, when Garrido was 21 years old, he was charged with drugging and raping a 14-year-old girl in Contra Costa County. This was not a misunderstanding or a case of murky consent between near peers. This was a grown man drugging and raping a child. The case should have resulted in prison time, should have flagged Garrido as a sexual predator, should have begun the process of removing him from society before he could hurt anyone else. Instead, the charges were dropped when the victim refused to testify. This happens frequently in sexual assault cases, where victims, especially young victims, are traumatized by the assault itself, and then further traumatized by the prospect of reliving their experience in court, of facing their attacker, of being cross-examined by defense attorneys. The 14-year-old girl in 1972 could not bring herself to go through that ordeal, and so Garrido walked free. The consequences of this decision would ripple forward through time, affecting lives that hadn't yet begun. If Garrido had been convicted in 1972, if he had been imprisoned and properly supervised afterward, Katie Calloway Hall might never have been kidnapped. Jaycee Dugard might have grown up to live a normal life. 2 children might never have been born in captivity in a backyard prison. The failure to prosecute Garrido in 1972 was the first in a chain of failures that would ultimately span nearly 4 decades. On November 22, 1976, Garrido struck again, this time with consequences that would temporarily remove him from society. His victim was Katie Calloway, a 25-year-old woman, working as a blackjack dealer at a casino in South Lake Tahoe, the same general area where, 15 years later, Garrido would find Jaycee. Katie was living her life, working her job, doing all the ordinary things that ordinary people do, when Garrido crossed her path. It was evening when Katie left a grocery store in South Lake Tahoe. She was heading to her boyfriend's house with a carload of food for dinner. In the parking lot, a young man with a ponytail approached her car and tapped on her window. His car wouldn't start, he said. Could she give him a ride? It was the kind of request that thousands of people make every day, the kind of small favor that strangers do for each other in a civil society. Katie agreed to help. She had no way of knowing that the man standing outside her window was a predator who had been hunting for a victim, that he had prepared a location specifically to torture whoever fell into his trap. What happened next was a nightmare that would haunt Katie for the rest of her life. Garrido handcuffed her, bound her, and drove her in her own car across state lines to a mini warehouse in Reno, Nevada. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of premeditation. Garrido had rented the storage unit in advance. He had stocked it with pornography, sex devices, and a mattress. He had created a maze of hanging carpets inside the unit to conceal what he planned to do there. He had prepared a torture chamber and gone looking for someone to put in it. For the next 8 hours, he raped Katie repeatedly. She was certain she was going to die. She begged for her life. She did everything she could think of to survive, to connect with her captor, to make him see her as a human being rather than an object. It was the longest night of her life, and it would cast a shadow over every night that followed. Katie Calloway's ordeal ended only by miraculous chance. A police officer, making routine rounds, noticed that a lock on one of the storage units had been broken. It was a minor thing, the kind of detail that could easily be overlooked. But the officer decided to investigate, to check inside and make sure nothing was wrong. What he found was Garrido and his victim. Katie was rescued. Garrido was arrested. And for once, the criminal justice system seemed prepared to take his crimes seriously. The criminal justice system, for once, seemed to take Garrido's crimes seriously. He was charged in federal court with kidnapping across state lines, since he had taken Katie from California to Nevada. He was also charged in Nevada State Court with rape, In 1977, he was convicted on both sets of charges: 50 years in federal prison for the kidnapping, and 5 years to life in state prison for the rape. Combined, his sentences should have kept him behind bars for most, if not all, of his natural life. But the American criminal justice system, then as now, has a way of failing to deliver on the promises its sentences seem to make. While serving his time at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, Garrido met the woman who would become his wife and his partner in crime, Nancy Bocanegra, the niece of a fellow inmate. In 1988, just 11 years after being sentenced to 50 years in prison, Philip Garrido was released on parole. The man who had kidnapped and raped Katie Calloway, who had shown himself capable of extreme sexual violence, who had specifically prepared a location to torture his victim, was deemed fit to return to society after serving barely a fifth of his federal sentence. As a condition of his release, Garrido was required to register as a sex offender and was placed on lifetime parole. He was supposed to be monitored, supervised, kept under watch to ensure he didn't reoffend. These were the conditions that were supposed to protect the public from a man who had already demonstrated exactly what he was capable of doing. Upon his release, Garrido reunited with Nancy Bocanegra, and they married. Together they moved to a house at 1554 Walnut Avenue in an unincorporated area of Antioch, California, a working-class suburb in Contra Costa County, about 40 miles east of San Francisco. The house belonged to Garrido's mother, and it came with a large backyard that would soon become a prison. In the years between his release in 1988 and the kidnapping of Jaycee Dugard in 1991, Garrido was supposedly being supervised by parole officers. But whatever supervision he received was clearly inadequate, because he had already begun preparing for his next victim. In the backyard of the house on Walnut Avenue, hidden from view by fences, trees, and tarps, Garrido constructed a soundproofed shed. He was building a cage for a human being, and no one noticed. On June 10, 1991, Philip and Nancy Garrido drove to South Lake Tahoe, the same area where Philip had abducted Katie Calloway 15 years earlier, with a specific purpose. They were going shopping for a victim. That's the phrase that prosecutors would later use to describe what the Garridos were doing that morning, cruising the streets, looking for a child to abduct. They found Jaycee. The stun gun Garrido used to incapacitate Jaycee was the same type of weapon he had used on Katie Calloway. The method was the same: approach the victim, immobilize her with electricity, drag her into the car. It was a technique he had refined, a process he had practiced. And this time, his accomplice was not a reluctant victim, but his willing wife, Nancy Garrido, who helped drag the 11-year-old into the back seat and held her down as they fled. The drive from Myers to Antioch was approximately 120 miles, about 3 hours under normal driving conditions. During that drive, as Jaycee drifted in and out of consciousness from the effects of the stun gun, Nancy removed her clothing, leaving her with only a butterfly-shaped ring that Jaycee would manage to hide from her captors for the next 18 years, a tiny connection to her former life, a secret reminder of who she really was. When they arrived at the house on Walnut Avenue, the Garridos took Jaycee, her head still covered with a blanket, behind the main house to the hidden backyard where Philip had prepared her prison. There, in a tiny shed that had been soundproofed to muffle any screams, they placed their 11-year-old captive. Garrido handcuffed Jaycee and left her naked in the shed, which was bolted shut from the outside. He told her that trained Doberman pinschers were waiting outside the shed door and that they would attack her if she tried to escape. Whether the dogs actually existed or were simply another tool of psychological control, the threat was effective. Jaycee, terrified and alone, did not try to escape. That first night, Garrido forced Jaycee to shower with him, the first time in her young life that she had been exposed to a naked adult male. It was the beginning of the systematic sexual abuse that would continue for years. In the days that followed, Garrido burned Jaycee's favorite pink outfit, the clothes she had been wearing when she was taken, the last physical connection to her normal life. He gave her a bucket to use as a toilet. He brought her fast food sometimes and talked to her, beginning the process of psychological manipulation that would keep her compliant and obedient. 5 days after her abduction, Garrido raped Jaycee for the first time. She was 11 years old. In her memoir, published years later, Jaycee would describe this as my first taste of pure evil. She wrote, "Maybe I didn't register that and go, 'Oh my God, you're evil.' But there's something inside of you that knows this is not right." For the next 18 months, Jaycee remained locked in the soundproofed shed, her only human contact being Garrido, when he came to assault her or bring her food. She was given a small television set, tuned permanently to the QVC shopping channel. The sound of human voices selling jewelry and housewares became her only connection to the outside world, and she found comfort in it, proof that the world still existed beyond the walls of her prison. Garrido forced Jaycee to adopt a new name, Alyssa. She was forbidden from using her real name, from speaking it, from writing it. When he discovered that she had signed her real name in a journal she was keeping about some kittens he had given her, she was forced to tear out the page. It would be the last time she would write or speak her real name for 18 years. The kittens themselves were another tool of control. Garrido would give Jaycee pets, allowing her to form attachments to them, and then the animals would mysteriously vanish. It was a way of teaching her that anything she loved could be taken away, that her captor had absolute power over every aspect of her existence. After about 18 months, Garrido began to allow Jaycee some limited freedom from her handcuffs for periods of time. He built an 8-foot-tall fence around a larger area of the backyard and set up a tent for her, the first time she had been allowed to walk outside since her kidnapping. But this expanded prison was still a prison. She did not leave the backyard compound for the first 4 years of her captivity. She never saw a doctor. She never saw a dentist. She had no education beyond the 5th grade she had completed before her abduction. She had no contact with anyone except the Garridos. She existed in a bubble of isolation, cut off from everything and everyone she had ever known. And then, in 1994, something happened that would change the nature of Jaycee's captivity forever. She discovered she was pregnant. It was Easter Sunday, 1994. The Christian celebration of resurrection and new life, of hope triumphing over despair. But for 14-year-old Jaycee, held captive for nearly 3 years in a backyard prison, Easter 1994 brought news that filled her with terror and confusion. The Garridos told her that she was going to have a baby. Jaycee was a child herself. She had been 11 when she was kidnapped, had just entered puberty, had no real understanding of sex or pregnancy beyond what Garrido had forced upon her. She had never had sex education, never had conversations with her mother about where babies come from, never had the chance to learn about her own body in a healthy, supportive environment. Everything she knew about sexuality, she had learned from her rapist. And now she was pregnant with his child. There was no prenatal care, no visits to an obstetrician, no ultrasounds to check on the developing baby, no vitamins, no monitoring, no medical attention of any kind. Jaycee was expected to carry this pregnancy to term in the backyard compound, with no resources beyond what the Garridos chose to provide. She watched videos about childbirth, trying to prepare herself for what was coming. These educational materials were her only guidance, her only source of information about the ordeal she was about to face. She had no idea what to really expect, no understanding of the pain and danger that awaited her. She was a child, alone, terrified, growing larger each day with the baby of the man who had stolen her life. On August 18, 1994, labor began. The contractions came in waves of agony, unlike anything Jaycee had ever experienced. She was in a shed in a backyard in Antioch, California, thousands of miles from any hospital, from any doctor, from any sterile medical environment. Her midwife was Nancy Garrido, the woman who had helped kidnap her, who had held her down in the car as they drove away from everything she knew and loved. It was very painful, Jaycee would later tell ABC's Diane Sawyer, in an understatement that barely begins to capture what that experience must have been like. A 14-year-old girl giving birth without pain medication, without proper medical care, without any of the support systems that mothers rely on. Just a shed, a bucket, and the woman who had helped destroy her life serving as her only assistance. "I didn't know I was in labor," Jaycee recalled. The pain was overwhelming, all-consuming, beyond anything the birthing videos had prepared her for. And then, finally, the baby emerged. "And then I saw her," Jaycee said. "She was beautiful. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I had somebody who was mine." In that moment, holding her newborn daughter in a backyard shed where she had been imprisoned for 3 years, Jaycee's life changed again. She was still a captive. She was still being abused. She was still trapped in a nightmare that showed no signs of ending. But now, she had a reason to live that went beyond mere survival. She had a child to protect, a person who depended on her, a human being who was hers, in a world where nothing else belonged to her anymore. "I knew I could never let anything happen to her," Jaycee said of her daughter. This first pregnancy was complicated enough, but it would not be the last. 3 years later, on November 13, 1997, Jaycee gave birth again, another daughter, also fathered by Philip Garrido. She was 17 years old, had been captive for more than 6 years, and now had 2 children to raise in a backyard prison. Both births took place in the same backyard compound, attended only by Nancy Garrido. Neither baby ever saw a doctor. Neither received any medical care beyond what Jaycee herself could provide. They grew up in the compound, knowing no other life, playing in the hidden space behind the fences and tarps, never going to school, never having friends their own age, never experiencing anything remotely resembling a normal childhood. Jaycee educated her daughters as best she could with her 5th grade education. She taught them to read, to write, to do basic arithmetic. She tried to give them some understanding of the world beyond the backyard, even though she herself had been cut off from that world for years. She was mother and teacher and protector doing everything she could to give her daughters some semblance of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. The question that haunts everyone who hears Jaycee's story is inevitable. Why didn't she try to escape? Why, over 18 years, with increasing freedom to move around the compound and eventually interact with the outside world, did she not make a break for freedom? The answers to this question are complex and speak to the psychological prison that was as powerful as any physical barrier. Garrido had spent years carefully constructing layers of control that went far beyond locks and fences. There were the explicit threats. The dogs that would supposedly attack her if she tried to leave. The stun gun that had incapacitated her on the day of her kidnapping and could be used again. The warnings about what would happen to her and her family if she disobeyed. There was the isolation. Jaycee had no idea where she was. She didn't know the address of the house, didn't know what city she was in, didn't know how to get back to Lake Tahoe or anywhere else familiar. If she escaped, where would she go? How would she survive? Who would help her? There was the manipulation. Garrido told Jaycee that the outside world was dangerous, that no one would believe her, that trying to escape would only make things worse. He told her that God would punish her and her family if she disobeyed. He created a worldview in which the backyard compound was the only safe place, and everything beyond its boundaries was threatening and unknown. And then there were the children. Once Jaycee's daughters were born, escape became exponentially more complicated. She couldn't leave them behind. They were everything to her, the only good things in her existence. But taking two children while trying to escape from their father, a man who had already demonstrated his capacity for violence and control, seemed impossibly dangerous. What if she tried to escape and failed? What would happen to her daughters then? I couldn't leave, Jaycee explained. I had the girls. There's also the phenomenon that psychologists call traumatic bonding, sometimes referred to as Stockholm Syndrome. Over years of captivity, victims can develop complex emotional relationships with their captors that go beyond simple fear. They become dependent on their captors for everything: food, shelter, human contact. And this dependence can create a kind of attachment that is difficult for outsiders to understand. After her rescue, Jaycee's stepfather noted that she had developed a significant emotional bond with Garrido. This wasn't love in any healthy sense. It was something more complicated, a survival mechanism, a way of making an unbearable situation bearable by finding some way to connect with the person who held her life in his hands. What I knew was safe, Jaycee explained later. The unknown out there was terrifying, especially when thinking about the girls. She was describing a psychological cage as powerful as any made of steel and concrete. After years in captivity, the outside world had become the threat, and her prison had become, in some twisted way, the only home she knew. The compound where Jaycee spent 18 years was a testament to Garrido's ability to hide in plain sight. Located at 15254 Walnut Avenue in an unincorporated area of Antioch, it was essentially a secret backyard within a larger backyard, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The main house sat on a normal-looking residential lot, but behind it, concealed by a 6-foot fence, tall trees, tarps, and strategically placed garbage cans, was a hidden world. 2 homemade tents, 2 sheds, one of which was soundproofed, a camping-style shower and toilet, and eventually what investigators would describe as a tent city housing Jaycee and her daughters. Garrido ran electricity to the compound using extension cords. He built a recording studio in one of the sheds where he recorded himself singing religious-themed and romantic country songs, part of his increasingly delusional belief system that he called God's desire. He had become convinced that he had discovered a way to cure sexual deviancy, and he developed elaborate theories about religion and sexuality that he would eventually try to share with the world. The Garridos also ran a small printing business, and over time, Jaycee was brought into this operation. She had access to a business phone and an email account. She interacted with clients. She sometimes answered the front door of the main house when people came by. She was, in these moments, mere feet from freedom, from people who could have helped her, but she never revealed her true identity or asked for help. Customers of the printing business, like a man named Schiavone Molino, would later describe meeting Jaycee and the girls without having any idea that anything was wrong. The girls, Molino said, never acted robotically in his presence and didn't wear unusual clothing. They seemed like a strange, but not necessarily threatening family. How was this possible? How could someone living in captivity interact with the outside world and never cry for help? The answer lies in the depth of Garrido's control and Jaycee's terror. She had been trained over years to obey, to conform, to never reveal the truth. She believed that if she tried to escape or ask for help, terrible things would happen to her and her daughters. The outside world had been described to her as dangerous, as hostile, as a place where no one would help her, and where her worst fears would be realized. Better to stay in the prison she knew than to risk the unknown terrors beyond. It's also worth noting that Jaycee's captivity occurred before the age of widespread internet access and social media. There was no easy way for her to send a message, no way to reach out anonymously for help. Her interactions with the outside world were always supervised, always controlled, always monitored. And yet, despite all of this, despite the elaborate precautions Garrido took to hide his crimes, there were multiple opportunities over the years when Jaycee could have been discovered and rescued. The failure of law enforcement to find her despite these opportunities represents one of the most catastrophic breakdowns of the parole system in American history. Philip Garrido was, remember, a registered sex offender on lifetime parole. He was supposed to be monitored. Parole officers were supposed to visit his home regularly, and they did, approximately 60 times over the years. After a 2006 law required felony sex offenders to wear GPS tracking devices, Garrido was fitted with an ankle monitor that tracked his every movement. And yet, no parole officer ever discovered the hidden compound in the backyard. No one ever found Jaycee or her daughters. The GPS tracking device, which was supposed to provide real-time information about Garrido's whereabouts, generated 335 alerts, indicating that the signal had been lost. Every single one of those alerts was ignored. The device showed Garrido spending significant amounts of time in the secret backyard, but no one was analyzing the data closely enough to notice or to wonder why a sex offender was spending so much time in a specific location on his property. An investigation conducted after Jaycee's rescue found that Garrido was properly supervised for only 12 out of the 123 months he was under California's jurisdiction, a failure rate of 90%. He should have been classified as a highly dangerous predator given his criminal history, but instead he was labeled a minimum level offender. Parole agents, overwhelmed with cases, had only about 45 minutes per week to spend on each of the offenders they were supposed to be monitoring. But the failures went beyond simple negligence. There were specific documented instances where Jaycee could have been found if anyone had followed up on the information that was available. In 1991, the same year Jaycee was kidnapped, a neighbor reported seeing a young blonde girl in Garrido's backyard who said her name was Jaycee. This report was apparently never properly investigated or connected to the ongoing missing person case. In June 2002, the Antioch Fire Department responded to a report of a juvenile with a shoulder injury that had occurred in a swimming pool at the Garrido's home. This information was not relayed to the parole office, which had no record of either a juvenile or a swimming pool at the Garrido's address. No one asked the obvious question: why did a registered sex offender have a child at his house? In 2006, one of Garrido's neighbors called 911 to report that there were tents in the backyard with children living there, and that Garrido was psychotic with sexual addictions. Deputies responded to the call, but they failed to conduct a thorough search. They never found the hidden compound. Jaycee and her daughters remained trapped. In 2008, just a year before Jaycee would finally be rescued, a parole officer actually found a young girl inside Garrido's house. This was a direct violation of his parole conditions, and yet, somehow, nothing was done. The parole officer failed to investigate further, failed to ask who the girl was, failed to take any action that might have led to Jaycee's discovery. These failures were not just bureaucratic oversights. They were life-altering catastrophes for Jaycee and her daughters. Each missed opportunity represented more years of captivity, more years of abuse, more years of a childhood and adolescence stolen. "The government failed me for 18 years, Jaycee would later write, and that will take time to heal from. By 2009, Jaycee had been Garrido's captive for more than 18 years. She was 29 years old, and she had spent more than half her life in the backyard compound. Her daughters were 15 and 11, the same ages Jaycee had been when she was first abducted and when she first became pregnant. The cycle of stolen childhood was repeating itself, with Jaycee's own daughters growing up knowing nothing but their confined existence. Garrido, meanwhile, had grown increasingly erratic and delusional. His God's Desire organization had become an obsession, and he was convinced that he had developed a solution to sexual deviancy that the world needed to hear. He had built a machine that he believed could convey divine messages, and he was eager to share his revelations with a wider audience. On August 24, 2009, Garrido decided to take his message to a bigger stage. He visited the San Francisco office of the FBI and left a 4-page essay containing his ideas about religion and sexuality. The essay was rambling and incoherent, describing how he had supposedly cured his own deviant behavior and how this information could help other sexual predators. But Garrido wasn't finished. Later that same day, he traveled to the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, one of the most prestigious public universities in the world, with a specific request. He wanted permission to hold a special event for his God's Desire program. And he brought company: his 2 daughters, ages 15 and 11. At the UC Berkeley campus police office, Garrido met with Lisa Campbell, the manager of the Special Events Unit. From the moment he walked in, Campbell sensed something was wrong. Garrido's behavior was erratic. He talked about his event being big and involving the government. But what really alarmed Campbell was the two girls with him. They were pale, like they hadn't been exposed to much sunlight. They were sullen and submissive. They didn't behave the way normal teenagers behave. Something about them made the hairs on the back of Campbell's neck stand up. Campbell scheduled an appointment with Garrido for the following afternoon, and, after he left, contacted campus police officer Allie Jacobs. Jacobs ran a background check on Garrido and discovered that he was a registered sex offender with a 1977 conviction for kidnapping and rape. She also discovered that he was on parole. The next day, August 25th, Garrido returned to the campus with his daughters for his scheduled meeting. This time, Officer Jacobs was present, and she began asking questions. She asked the girls about school, about their lives, about who they were. The girls mentioned that they had an older sister who was in her 20s, a reference to Jaycee, whom they had been raised to call their sister. Jacobs asked Garrido what he was doing with the girls. "I'm socializing them," he replied, "showing them how it's done." What is done?" Jacobs pressed. It was a red flag, and Jacobs knew it. She called Garrido's parole officer to report her concerns. The parole officer was shocked. According to his records, Garrido didn't have any daughters. There was no record of any children living at his address. This disconnect between what Jacobs was seeing and what the parole system believed to be true set in motion the events that would finally bring Jaycee's nightmare to an end. Garrido's parole officer at the time was a man named Edward Santos, Jr. When Santos received the call from UC Berkeley about Garrido being on campus with two girls, he took immediate action. He went to the Garrido house in Antioch and demanded to know about the children. Garrido was evasive. He claimed the girls were gone, that their dad picked them up. Santos didn't buy it. He ordered Garrido to come to the parole office the next morning with the girls and their parents. On August 26, 2009, Philip Garrido arrived at the parole office in Concord, California. With him were Nancy Garrido, the two girls, and a young woman who introduced herself as Alyssa. This was Jaycee, meeting with authorities for the first time in 18 years, still using the name Garrido had given her, still protecting her captor, even as the walls were closing in. Santos questioned all of them, trying to untangle the web of lies about who these girls were and who their parents were. Each adult gave a different story. The inconsistencies were glaring. Santos kept pushing, kept asking questions, even as his supervisors questioned whether he was going too far. There were multiple times I could have just documented this and let it go, but I didn't, Santos would later say. I sit here and I think to myself, if I just would have let it go, if I just would have let it be. But I couldn't have done that. On that particular day with those two little girls, I was their guardian. At first, Jaycee tried to protect Garrido. She told Santos that he was a good man. She claimed to be from Minnesota, hiding from an abusive husband. After 18 years of captivity, her instinct was still to obey, to cover for her captor, to maintain the lies she had been forced to live. But Santos kept pushing. And finally, the truth came out. He nods his head 3 times, Santos would recall of the moment Garrido confessed, and says, a long, long time ago, I kidnapped her and raped her when she was a child. Philip and Nancy Garrido were immediately placed under arrest. Federal, state, and local authorities descended on the parole office and took over the investigation. And an FBI agent made a phone call that Terry Probyn had been waiting 18 years to receive. Her daughter was alive. On August 27, 2009, Jaycee Lee Dugard was reunited with her mother for the first time since that June morning in 1991 when she had walked to the bus stop in her favorite pink outfit and never come back. She was 29 years old. She had spent 18 years, 2 months, and 17 days in captivity. The news of Jaycee's rescue and the circumstances of her captivity shocked the nation. How could a registered sex offender keep a kidnapped child in his backyard for 18 years? How could the parole system have failed so catastrophically? How could so many opportunities to discover her have been missed? Carl Probyn, who had lived under a cloud of suspicion for years, described his reaction to learning that Jaycee was alive as like winning the lottery. After 18 years of being looked at as a potential perpetrator, he was finally vindicated. His description of the car, the suspects, everything he had told investigators in those first frantic hours after the kidnapping, it had all been correct. "I told them it was a man and a woman," Carl said. "I said it was an '85 Ford Monarch gray 4-door. And it turned out they had the car in the backyard." The very vehicle that had been used to kidnap Jaycee had been sitting on the Garridos' property for 18 years. Jaycee retained custody of her 2 daughters, who had never known any life except captivity, who had never been to school or seen a doctor, who had been raised believing that Garrido was their father and that the backyard compound was simply where they lived. They were staying at a Bay Area motel, trying to process a world they had never really known. The daughters, Carl Probyn noted, cried when they learned of their father's arrest. They had been raised by Garrido, manipulated by him, taught to see him as their parent and protector. Learning the truth about what he was and what he had done would be a process of its own, separate from but parallel to Jaycee's healing. The investigation that followed Jaycee's rescue revealed the full horror of what had been happening behind the fence at 1554 Walnut Avenue. Investigators documented the hidden compound, the soundproofed shed where Jaycee had spent her first 18 months in captivity, the tents where she had lived with her daughters, the primitive toilet and shower, the extension cords providing electricity to this makeshift prison. Aerial photographs clearly showed the blue tarps that had concealed the compound from view, tarps that parole officers had walked past dozens of times without ever investigating what lay beneath them. The compound was invisible from neighboring properties, invisible from the main house's backyard, invisible to everyone who should have been looking. Police also investigated whether Garrido had committed other crimes during his years of freedom. He was named as a suspect in several other California kidnapping cases, including the 1988 abduction of 9-year-old Michaela Garrecht from Hayward, California. The similarities between Michaela's abduction and Jaycee's were striking. Both girls were around the same age. Both were taken in broad daylight with witnesses present. Both cases had remained unsolved for years. Investigators searched the Garrido property extensively for evidence of other crimes, even digging in the backyard looking for possible remains. They searched neighboring properties and the homes of Garrido's business associates, but ultimately no additional charges were filed. Whatever other crimes Garrido may have committed, the evidence was not sufficient to prosecute. On April 28, 2011, nearly 2 years after Jaycee's rescue, Philip and Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to the charges against them. Philip pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault, including 6 counts of rape and 7 counts of committing lewd acts that had been captured on video. Nancy pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of rape by force. The sentencing hearing was held on June 2, 2011. Jaycee chose not to attend. In a statement read by her mother, she explained why. "I chose not to be here today because I refuse to waste another second of my life in your presence." The statement Jaycee prepared was lengthy and powerful. Addressed directly to Philip Garrido, it laid bare the horror of what he had done and the rage she felt about the years he had stolen from her. "Everything you ever did to me was wrong, and I hope one day you will see that," Jaycee wrote. "I hated every second of every day for 18 years because of you. You stole my life and that of my family." To Nancy Garrido, Jaycee had only this to say: "I have nothing to say." It was a dismissal more devastating than any condemnation, a declaration that Nancy wasn't even worth the energy of hatred. Terry Probin, Jaycee's mother, delivered her own statement to the court, describing the hell she had lived through during the 18 years her daughter was missing. "The day Jaycee was taken, my world went dark and my sunshine was taken away," Terry said. "I begged, I pleaded, I cried, I ranted and raved. I went crazy and thought I was going to go insane. My baby was gone, and all of my dreams turned to nightmares. Dreadful nightmarish thoughts of her bondage and of her suffering. For 18 excruciating years, I endured a huge gaping hole in my heart that some evil being had put their hand into and had ripped out. For 18 agonizing years, I guarded what little I had left and lived in hell on this earth." Judge Douglas Phimister, before pronouncing sentence, addressed the Garridos directly. "Basically, what you did was you took a human being and turned them into a chattel, a piece of furniture, to be used by you at your whim," he said. "You reinvented slavery. That's what you did." The judge revealed new details about the day of Jaycee's abduction, information that had emerged during the investigation. The Garridos had gone shopping for a young girl to abduct that day. They had been cruising the streets, specifically looking for a victim. Jaycee wasn't a target of opportunity. She was hunted. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. It was a sentence designed to ensure that he would never see freedom again, that he would die behind bars. He waived his right to appeal. Nancy Garrido received a sentence of 36 years to life, the maximum possible based on the sentencing laws that were in effect in 1991 when Jaycee was kidnapped. Nancy would be eligible for parole in 2029, a possibility that Jaycee and her family would have to live with. In addition to the criminal consequences, the state of California acknowledged its own culpability in Jaycee's prolonged captivity. The failures of the parole system had been documented and publicized. The missed visits, the ignored GPS alerts, the failure to investigate reports from neighbors, the 90% failure rate in properly supervising Garrido. California paid Jaycee a settlement of $20 million, an acknowledgement that the state had failed in its responsibility to monitor a dangerous sex offender, and that this failure had cost Jaycee 18 years of her life. The California Inspector General's report on Garrido's supervision was damning. It found that parole agents had ignored hundreds of alerts from Garrido's GPS device. It found that visits to his home had been cursory and incomplete. It found that communications between agencies had broken down at critical moments. It found that Garrido had been misclassified as a low-level offender when his criminal history clearly indicated he was extremely dangerous. Here we have a guy who is essentially under every kind of supervision we allow, said Robert Coombs of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Law enforcement had every tool available to them, and they failed. Matthew Cate, then the Secretary of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, was forced to acknowledge the failures publicly. Mistakes were made by the department and by this agent, he said. But he also pointed to systemic issues. Parole agents were overworked, each one responsible for dozens of offenders, with only about 45 minutes per week to spend on each case. The GPS devices that were supposed to provide constant monitoring were not being analyzed in any meaningful way. The state had invested approximately $500 million in GPS devices for 6,600 sex offenders. But as Coombs pointed out, we know where this guy is, so we think we're safe. But the place where we knew he was the place where he was offending. One person who had been watching the Garrido case unfold with particular intensity was Katie Calloway Hall, Garrido's first known victim, the woman he had kidnapped and raped in 1976. Katie had spent more than 3 decades living in fear that Garrido would come after her again. She had changed her name, moved repeatedly, always looking over her shoulder. She had been assured by parole officials that Garrido would be monitored for the rest of his life, that he would be in a fish bowl, that she didn't need to worry. She had tried to believe them. When she saw Garrido's face on the television news in August 2009, she started screaming, "Oh my God! Oh my God! That's who did it! That's who kidnapped me!" The arrest of Garrido for the Dugard kidnapping validated Katie's worst fears about what he was capable of. She had known, in her bones, that he was dangerous. She had known that his early release from prison was a mistake. And now she had proof. The man who had raped her for 8 hours in 1976 had gone on to kidnap and rape a child for 18 years. He had me for 8 hours, Katie said. He had her for 18 years. Katie attended the court hearings as a self-described watchdog, determined to ensure that this time Garrido would be put away forever. She made eye contact with him in the courtroom. The same old fears came back that I felt 33 years ago when he had me, she said afterward. Katie's message to the system that had failed both her and Jaycee was simple. How did it fail so badly? How did they not know? In the years since her rescue, Jaycee Dugard has worked to rebuild the life that was stolen from her. It hasn't been easy. She has described the process of healing as ongoing, something that requires constant effort and attention. Immediately after her rescue, Jaycee began working with a therapist named Dr. Rebecca Bailey, who specializes in helping victims of trauma. A key part of her therapy involved animal-assisted work with horses, an activity she shared with her mother Terry and her sister Shayna. The horses provided a way for Jaycee to rebuild trust, to learn to form connections, to experience the kind of unconditional acceptance that had been denied her for so long. One of the most important things of working with survivors of abduction, Dr. Bailey explained, is allowing them to have choices in every single thing. For Jaycee, who had spent 18 years with no choices at all, learning to make decisions for herself was a crucial part of recovery. On July 12, 2011, exactly 2 years after the sentencing hearing, Jaycee published her memoir, A Stolen Life. The book, which she wrote as part of her therapy, details her years in captivity in harrowing terms. It was an immediate bestseller, reaching #1 on Amazon sales rankings even before its official release and topping the New York Times bestseller list for 6 weeks. A Stolen Life chronicles her growth from victim to survivor, from terror to strength, wrote Maria L. Laganga of the Los Angeles Times. Janet Maslin of the New York Times described Jaycee as courageous and dignified in recounting such a traumatic life experience. A few days before the book was released, Jaycee gave her first extensive television interview to ABC's Diane Sawyer, the first of several conversations between the two women over the years. In that interview, Jaycee described what it had been like to survive her captivity, to give birth to her daughters in captivity, to finally be free. "There's a switch that I had to shut off," Jaycee explained about surviving her ordeal. "So it's just, you do what you have to do to survive." In March 2012, Jaycee made her first public appearance since her rescue, attending an awards ceremony at the United Nations where she received a Lifetime Leadership Honor from fashion designer Diane von Furstenberg's DVF Awards. She was recognized for her courage and for her work with the JAYC Foundation, which she had established to help families dealing with abduction and other traumatic experiences. On July 12, 2016, Jaycee published her second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts. This book focused not on her years in captivity, but on her life since her rescue. Learning to drive, ordering pizza in New York City for the first time, experiencing all the small pleasures of normal life that she had been denied for so long. "Just walking down the street," Jaycee told Diane Sawyer in another interview. "With everybody. It was my favorite moment." Jaycee has spoken about the ongoing nature of her healing, about the ways in which her captivity continues to affect her even as she builds a new life. She has never been on a date. She was 11 when she was abducted, with no experience of normal adolescence, no first crush, no high school romance. But she doesn't rule out finding love someday. "I feel like I have lived a lot of lifetimes," she has said. Her daughters, whose names have never been made public, have also worked to build normal lives. They have attended college, achieving something their mother was denied. Jaycee has said that if her daughters ever wanted to see their father in prison, she wouldn't be okay with it, but she wouldn't stop them. It's their choice to make. As for Jaycee's mother, Terry Probin, she has been a constant presence in her daughter's recovery, but she continues to struggle with her own demons. In interviews, she has spoken about the anger that still consumes her, the hatred she feels for the Garridos, the difficulty of moving past what happened. "I think I have enough hate in my heart for the both of us," Terry told Diane Sawyer in one interview, speaking of herself and Jaycee. "I hate that he took her life away. I hate that he stole her from me. He ripped out a piece of my heart, and he stole my baby." Even years after Jaycee's return, Terry has described being filled with terror whenever her daughter is out of sight. "The thoughts flood. Is she going to come back? Am I ever going to see her again?" she has said. "And then I'll hear her skulking around the kitchen, and I'll think, oh, it's okay. She is here. She is home." As of the most recent reports, Philip Garrido remains incarcerated. In 2022, He was reported to be in the Corcoran State Prison in the Protective Housing Unit, the same unit that has housed other notorious criminals, including Charles Manson. The California Department of Corrections does not publicly disclose his current exact location, but he will almost certainly die behind bars. Nancy Garrido is incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino. She will become eligible for parole in August 2029, more than 38 years after she helped abduct an 11-year-old girl from a quiet street in South Lake Tahoe. Edward Santos Jr., the parole agent whose persistence led to Jaycee's rescue, retired from the California Department of Corrections in December 2021. In November 2022, he broke his 13-year silence about the case in an interview with KCRA-TV in Sacramento. Santos revealed that he had been told not to speak publicly about the case, to keep quiet, and hopefully you'll keep your job. He had always wanted to tell his side of the story, to explain how close he came to letting Garrido go that day in August 2009, and why he chose not to. You know, I tell people the planets, the moon, the stars were all in perfect alignment that day, Santos said. There were multiple times I could have just documented this and let it go, but I didn't. Santos also had a message for Jaycee, whom he hasn't spoken to since the day of her discovery. I wish I would have been able to discover you being captive the first day I walked into that house. So I am sorry for that, but I did my job that particular day. The story of Jaycee Dugard's abduction and rescue is in many ways a story about systems failing and individuals succeeding. The systems, the parole system, the GPS monitoring system, the communication between agencies, failed catastrophically, allowing a known predator to keep a child captive for 18 years in plain sight. But individuals, Lisa Campbell and Allie Jacobs at UC Berkeley, Edward Santos Jr. at the parole office, trusted their instincts, pushed when they could have let things go, and ultimately brought Jaycee home. It's worth pausing to consider just how many things had to go wrong for Jaycee to remain captive for 18 years, and how many things had to go right for her to finally be rescued. The failures began before Jaycee was even born, when Garrido was charged with raping a 14-year-old in 1972, and the charges were dropped. If he had been convicted then, if he had been imprisoned, if his name had been entered into the system as a sexual predator, perhaps the events that followed could have been prevented. But he wasn't convicted. He walked free. And 4 years later, he kidnapped and raped Katie Calloway Hall. Then came the failure to keep Garrido in prison. He was sentenced to 50 years for kidnapping, 5 years to life for rape. Combined, those sentences should have kept him behind bars until at least 2027, well past the age when most sexual predators commit crimes. Instead, he was released after just 11 years, deemed fit to return to society by a parole board that apparently saw something in him worth saving, or, more likely, was simply following bureaucratic procedures without fully considering the human consequences. Then came the failures of parole supervision. 60 visits to Garrido's home over the years, and not once did a parole officer discover the hidden compound, despite it being visible in aerial photographs, despite neighbors reporting suspicious activity, despite all the evidence that something was terribly wrong. The GPS monitoring system, which was supposed to provide constant surveillance, generated hundreds of alerts that were systematically ignored. An elaborate system designed to protect the public from predators like Garrido, turned out to be nothing more than expensive window dressing. Then came the specific missed opportunities. The 1991 neighbor report about a blonde girl named Jaycee. The 2002 fire department visit to treat a child at the house. The 2006 neighbor call about children living in tents in the backyard. The 2008 parole visit that found a young girl in violation of parole conditions. Each of these should have triggered an investigation. Each should have led to Jaycee's discovery. Each was a chance to end her nightmare years earlier. And each chance was squandered through incompetence, indifference, or institutional failure. Against this backdrop of systemic failure, the rescue in August 2009 seems almost miraculous. It required Garrido to make an unusual decision to take his daughters to UC Berkeley for his delusional religious project. It required Lisa Campbell to notice that something was wrong with the girls and to take the unusual step of alerting campus police rather than just sending Garrido on his way. It required Allie Jacobs to run a background check on a visitor, something she had no obligation to do. It required Jacobs to contact Garrido's parole officer rather than simply letting the matter drop. It required Edward Santos Jr. to push for answers even when his supervisors were questioning his actions. And it required Jaycee, after 18 years of protecting her captor, to finally break down and reveal her true identity. If any one of these dominoes hadn't fallen exactly right, Jaycee might still be in that backyard today. Or she might be dead. We'll never know what would have happened if the UC Berkeley encounter hadn't occurred, but we do know that the system wasn't trending toward finding her. She could have remained captive for another decade, for another 2 decades, for the rest of her life. She was only rescued because individual humans chose to act when the systems around them failed. This is both an inspiring and a deeply troubling lesson. Inspiring because it shows that individual action matters, that one person paying attention can save lives. Troubling because it suggests that our elaborate systems of protection, our sex offender registries, our parole supervision, our GPS monitoring, may be far less effective than we believe. We cannot rely on those systems to protect the vulnerable. We must also rely on ourselves, on our willingness to notice when something is wrong, and to act on that knowledge even when it would be easier to look away. The case of Jaycee Dugard transformed the way California and other states approach the monitoring of sex offenders. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, there were investigations, reforms, new policies designed to prevent similar failures in the future. Parole officers were supposed to conduct more thorough searches. GPS data was supposed to be analyzed more carefully. Communication between agencies was supposed to improve. Whether these reforms have actually made anyone safer is difficult to know. The sad truth is that systems tend to revert to their previous states once the spotlight moves away. The parole officers who were supposed to search more thoroughly still have overwhelming caseloads. The GPS data that was supposed to be analyzed still generates more alerts than anyone can properly review. The communication between agencies still breaks down at critical moments. The next Jaycee Dugard might be out there right now, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to act. But it's also a story about resilience, about the human capacity to survive unimaginable horror and to build a meaningful life on the other side. Jaycee Dugard lost her childhood, her adolescence, her young adulthood. She was raped, tortured, manipulated, and imprisoned. She gave birth twice as a teenager in a backyard shed with no medical care. And yet she survived. She found ways to cope, to protect her daughters, to maintain some sense of self, even when her captor was trying to erase everything she had been. Those things happened to her, Dr. Bailey has said of Jaycee. They're not who she is. Today, Jaycee Dugard is an author, an advocate, a mother, a daughter reunited with her family. She runs a foundation that helps other families dealing with abduction and trauma. She has learned to drive, traveled to New York, experienced the small freedoms that most of us take for granted. She has also chosen not to let anger define her recovery. I didn't want to give one more minute to Philip and Nancy, she has said. They took 18 years of my life. Every day that she lives fully, every experience she allows herself to have, every moment of joy she finds, these are her victories, reclaimed from the man who tried to destroy her. In interviews, Jaycee has spoken about the conscious choice she makes every day not to be consumed by bitterness and rage. It would be easy. It would be entirely understandable for her to spend the rest of her life hating the Garridos, hating the system that failed her, hating a world that allowed her to suffer for so long. Many survivors of trauma do exactly that, and no one would blame them. But Jaycee chose a different path. She chose to focus on what she could build, rather than what was taken from her. She chose to find joy in the small things. A walk down a city street, a pizza ordered for delivery, a horse ride with her therapist, rather than dwelling on the 18 years she spent in a backyard prison. She chose to help others through her foundation, rather than retreating into isolation and pain. This is not to say that her recovery has been easy or complete. Healing from trauma is not a straight line. There are good days and bad days, moments of profound peace, and moments when the memories come flooding back unbidden. The scars of what Jaycee endured will be with her forever, written into her psyche in ways that no amount of therapy or time can fully erase. But she has built a life. That is the remarkable thing, despite everything, despite 18 years of rape and imprisonment and psychological torture, despite giving birth twice in a backyard shed, despite watching her daughters grow up in captivity, despite all the horrors she endured, Jaycee Dugard has built a life worth living. She has found purpose and meaning, and yes, moments of genuine happiness. Those things happened to her, Dr. Rebecca Bailey has said of Jaycee. They're not who she is. That distinction between what happened to you and who you are is perhaps the most important insight anyone can take from Jaycee's story. We are not defined solely by our worst experiences. We have the capacity to transcend our suffering, to integrate our trauma into a larger story of survival and growth, to become more than the sum of our wounds. The case of Jaycee Dugard transformed the way California and other states approached the monitoring of sex offenders. It exposed the inadequacy of GPS tracking when not properly analyzed. It revealed the dangers of overworked parole officers with impossible caseloads. It showed how communication failures between agencies can have devastating consequences. It demonstrated that we cannot simply check boxes and assume that dangerous individuals are being adequately supervised. In the years since Jaycee's rescue, there have been reforms. Parole policies have been tightened. GPS monitoring has been improved. Communication protocols between agencies have been updated. Whether these changes have actually prevented other abductions is impossible to know. You can't measure crimes that didn't happen. But the awareness that cases like Jaycee's raised has almost certainly saved lives, has almost certainly prompted individuals in various agencies to pay closer attention, to ask the extra question, to search the backyard one more time. But perhaps most importantly, Jaycee's story showed that even in the darkest circumstances, hope can survive. For 18 years, Jaycee held onto a butterfly-shaped ring, the only possession from her former life that she managed to hide from her captors. For 18 years, she remembered who she really was, even when she was forbidden from speaking her own name. And when the moment finally came, when the walls of her prison finally fell, she was ready to reclaim her life. The butterfly ring is a powerful symbol. In many cultures, butterflies represent transformation and rebirth, the emergence of something beautiful from a period of darkness and confinement. Jaycee, during her 18 years in captivity, was like a caterpillar in a cocoon, trapped, unable to grow in the ways she should have, waiting for a metamorphosis that must have seemed like it would never come. When she was finally freed, she had to learn to spread wings she had never been allowed to develop, to fly in a world she had only glimpsed through a small TV set, tuned to QVC. That she has learned to fly at all is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. That she has chosen to use her freedom to help others, to tell her story so that other survivors know they are not alone, to build a foundation that provides support for families dealing with abduction and trauma. These choices speak to something even more remarkable. Jaycee Dugard could have chosen to disappear into anonymity after her rescue. No one would have blamed her. Instead, she chose to transform her pain into purpose, her trauma into a tool for healing. For parents watching this video, Jaycee's story is terrifying. It forces us to confront the reality that our children are not as safe as we want to believe, that predators exist and sometimes they win, that even in supposedly safe communities, evil can reach out and snatch away the people we love most. But her story is also instructive. It reminds us to pay attention, to trust our instincts, to investigate when something seems wrong rather than assuming everything is fine. Lisa Campbell and Allie Jacobs weren't trained investigators. They were just people who noticed that something was off and chose to act on that perception. Their example should inspire all of us to do the same. For survivors of abuse and trauma, Jaycee's story offers something precious, proof that healing is possible. If a woman who spent half her life in a backyard prison, who was raped by her captor for years, who gave birth to 2 children in captivity, can rebuild her life and find joy and purpose, then maybe there is hope for everyone. Maybe the worst things that happen to us don't have to be the final word. Maybe, with time and support and determination, we can all emerge from our own periods of darkness into something like light. Thanks for being here and listening to Jaycee's story. Her courage in sharing what happened to her, in writing her memoirs and giving interviews and founding her organization, has helped countless survivors know that they are not alone. Her willingness to live publicly, to use her platform to advocate for change, has made the world a slightly safer place for children everywhere. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe, take care with your loved ones, and remember that even after the longest night, dawn eventually comes. For Jaycee Dugard, dawn came on August 26, 2009, in a parole office in Concord, California. For 18 years, she had been waiting in darkness. And then finally, miraculously, the sun rose,